There are moments in sports media where everything shifts at once, where someone who has been holding a position publicly, confidently, on record, suddenly walks back into the room and tears the whole thing down. Those moments matter, not because of the drama, because of what they reveal about the truth that was building underneath the surface the entire time. This is one of those moments. Dakich, Fox Sports analyst, host of Don't At Me, one of the most recognized sports voices in the state of Indiana, has completely reversed course on Stephanie White. And when you understand the full scope of what just happened, what led to it, what it means, and what it says about the direction of one of the most important franchises in women's basketball right now, you will understand why this story is not just another piece of sports commentary noise. This is a reckoning, and it has been a long time coming. But to understand why Dakich's reversal hits as hard as it does, you have to go all the way back to the night that cracked everything open. You have to go back to June 24th, 2026. You have to go back to a basketball game that turned into something much bigger than basketball. It was a Wednesday evening in Indianapolis. The Indiana Fever were hosting the Phoenix Mercury at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, and on paper, it looked like a competitive mid-season WNBA matchup. Caitlin Clark was averaging career-best numbers, 21.2 points per game, 8.2 assists, shooting 43% from the field. She was playing the best basketball of her professional life. The Fever were 10-18, battling for positioning, and Clark was the engine driving everything. With 6 minutes and 52 seconds left in the second quarter, a loose ball scramble broke out near the basket. Clark drove toward the lane and ended up on the floor. Phoenix Mercury forward Lexi Held, veteran forward Dawana Bonner, and Alyssa Thomas all collapsed on Clark as they fought for possession. And then it happened. As the players tried to untangle themselves and recover the ball, Thomas thrust her fist directly into Clark's throat. She made contact with the neck and throat area. She got up, and she stepped directly over Clark's body. No foul was called. The referee said afterward that they simply did not see it. Clark stayed in the game. She is the kind of player who absorbs contact and keeps moving. She said during her rookie season that she already knew she was going to take hard shots every night, and that she was trying not to let it get to her. But later in that same game, she landed awkwardly on another play following contact from Mercury forward Valeriane AI, and she eventually had to exit. The Fever lost 111-109 in one of the more painful defeats of their season. And then the video surfaced. A slow-motion clip spread across social media almost immediately, showing exactly what Thomas had done. The fist, the throat, the step-over. It was unmistakable. Within hours, the clip had been viewed millions of times. Fans were furious, former players were furious, commentators across the sports landscape were furious, and the WNBA, to its credit on this one occasion, moved quickly. Less than 24 hours after the incident, the league announced its ruling. Alyssa Thomas was assessed a flagrant foul, penalty 2, and suspended for 1 game. The WNBA's official statement described the contact as Thomas recklessly making contact with her fist to the throat area of Clark and labeled it a non-basketball act. The league cited its authority to review plays after games and upgrade fouls when the evidence demands it. It was the first suspension of Alyssa Thomas's entire 13-year professional career. 13 years. And it happened because she punched Caitlin Clark in the throat on a nationally covered game. Now here is where things get interesting, because in the immediate aftermath of the incident, in that post-game press conference on the night of June 24th, Stephanie White came out swinging hard. We have a generational talent and a WNBA superstar who had 2 cheap shots right there that weren't called, White said at the podium, her voice sharp and direct. Absolutely unacceptable. She went further. She talked about officiating consistency, about how Clark is not called the same way as other players, about the fist in the throat was not just bad officiating, but dangerous. The fist in the throat is crazy, she said. It's crazy. It's dangerous. She mentioned the entire offseason the league spent discussing officiating improvements, and she made it clear she was not satisfied with the results. For one night, Stephanie White sounded exactly like the head coach Fever fans had been waiting to see. She sounded like someone who understood the assignment. She sounded like a coach who was willing to stand in front of a camera and fight for her player. That lasted about 24 hours. July 1st, 2026. Stephanie White is at the podium again. The Indiana Fever are preparing for their next game, and the media is assembled, ready to follow up on everything that happened with Thomas, with Clark's back injury, with the suspension, with the aftermath. This was the moment for White to double down, to draw a firm, unambiguous line in the sand, to make it crystal clear on record for the entire sports world to hear that she and this franchise stand behind Caitlin Clark without reservation. Instead, she opened with this. Before we start with questions, I just want to address what's going on with AT. AT. Not Clark. Not the Indiana Fever's own player, not the woman who was punched in the throat in her own arena. Stephanie White opened her press conference by announcing that her first order of business was Alyssa Thomas, a Phoenix Mercury player, a player from the opposing team, the player responsible for the incident that had the entire sports world in an uproar. She then proceeded to deliver a statement that lasted several minutes. Racism, homophobia, online toxicity, the broader WNBA community, and the threats being directed at Thomas in the wake of her suspension. It's absolutely unacceptable, White said. As a league as a whole, there's been so much more toxicity, racism, homophobia, BS, hate, nonsense, and it's absolutely unacceptable. Most of this comes from the online community. In my heart of hearts, I really believe most of it doesn't come from WNBA fans or Indiana Fever fans. I think it comes from people who are using our league, using our players to further divisive agendas. Now, to be fair, and it matters to be fair here, online harassment is real. Death threats directed at any athlete, regardless of context, are never acceptable. Alyssa Thomas saying she received threats and racist messages after the suspension is a genuine concern that deserves to be taken seriously. Nobody with any credibility is arguing that online abuse is okay. But that is not what made this press conference a problem. The problem was the framing. The problem was the prioritization. The problem was that the head coach of the Indiana Fever, the woman responsible for Caitlin Clark's professional environment, the woman whose job it is to protect and advocate for her players, walked up to that podium and made Alyssa Thomas the centerpiece of her opening statement. Not Clark. Not Clark's back injury, not Clark's protection going forward. Not a single word about what the Fever organization is going to demand from the league to ensure this does not happen again to their most important player. Thomas, the player who punched Clark in the throat. That was who Stephanie White chose to lead with. Think about the optics of that for a moment. Caitlin Clark is sitting out of games with a back injury. She was struck in the throat by an opposing player on her own court. The entire sports media landscape is talking about whether the WNBA can protect its biggest star. And the response from the head coach of the Indiana Fever is to deliver a 3-minute speech about the online treatment of Alyssa Thomas. This is what broke the dam. This is what made everything that came next inevitable. Before you can understand why Dakich's reversal carries the weight that it does, you need to understand exactly who he is and where he was standing just weeks before he unloaded on White. Dan Dakich is not a fringe voice. He is not some anonymous account on the internet throwing hot takes into the void. He's a 63-year-old former college basketball player and coach. He spent years as a college coach and has built a substantial media career, most prominently with Fox Sports through his Don't At Me podcast and his appearances on Outkick. He's an Indiana man through and through. He's embedded in that state's sports culture, and he has connections and credibility within the Indiana sports ecosystem that very few outside voices can match. And as recently as early June, just weeks before his public reversal, Dakich was standing firmly in Stephanie White's corner. He was not defending her quietly either. He was publicly critical of Caitlin Clark. During the fallout from the viral sideline confrontation between Clark and White during Indiana's 100-84 loss to the Portland Fire on May 30th, Dakich came out swinging at Clark specifically. He said on his show, for his audience, that watching Clark, you get really tired of it. He dismissed comparisons between Clark and Michael Jordan, saying Clark was no Jordan and Jordan didn't dribble down the court being literally on every call, being at her coaches, being at everybody. He backed White's coaching decisions. He essentially argued that Clark's frustration with her coach was unbecoming and that White was right to challenge her. Now, let that sit for a moment. This is the same man who is now publicly asking why it is so hard for Stephanie White and the Fever front office to 100% unequivocally support Caitlin Clark, calling the situation jackassery in his own words. The same man who once defended White against Clark's perceived emotional outbursts is now the one who's saying White's handling of Alyssa Thomas is indefensible. That is not a minor adjustment in perspective. That is a complete 180. And when someone with Dakich's profile and history makes that kind of turn, publicly, loudly, without walking it back, it means something significant happened to change his mind. What changed his mind was July 1st. What changed his mind was watching Stephanie White stand at a podium and defend Alyssa Thomas while her own franchise player was sitting out games with a back injury suffered in the same incident. In his reaction, Dakich zeroed in on what he saw as the core failure. He questioned whether the WNBA is actually operating as a legitimate sports league or functioning as something else entirely. A question that many critics in the media have been raising, framed as a matter of genuine institutional dysfunction rather than athletic competition. His position was blunt. There is not a serious coach in any serious league who would defend a player from the opposing team who intentionally injured one of their own players. Full stop. And yet that is exactly what the evidence suggests Stephanie White did. He also raised something that had not gotten nearly enough attention in the mainstream. Clark and her Fever teammate Sophie Cunningham have both been the victims of real, documented, legally prosecuted stalking incidents. A federal judge sentenced a man named Michael Lewis to 2.5 years in prison for stalking Clark. Another man named Kevin Singh was sentenced for stalking Cunningham. These are not online comments. These are not internet trolls. These are people who were arrested, prosecuted, and sent to prison for the threats they posed to Fever players. And Stephanie White, the same coach who spent 3 minutes at a press conference addressing the online treatment of Alyssa Thomas, has never once publicly addressed the stalking situations faced by her own players. Not once. Dakich called that out directly. Clark and Cunningham have had serious stalkers that have been arrested, and this coach has never said a word, he posted publicly. The contrast is not subtle. It is stark, and it is damning, and it is the kind of contrast that makes it almost impossible to argue that White's priorities are properly aligned with the people she is supposed to be protecting. While all of this was unfolding, while the throat punch aftermath was still dominating the news cycle, while Dakich was in the process of publicly changing his position, the WNBA dropped another bombshell that added an entirely new layer to this already explosive situation. On July 2nd, 2026, the league released the full voting breakdown for the 2026 WNBA All-Star Game, scheduled for July 25th in Chicago. And buried inside that data was a number that sent shockwaves across the sports world. Caitlin Clark, the player averaging 21.2 points and 8.2 assists per game, leading all guards in the league in assists, putting up career-best numbers across virtually every statistical category, was ranked 11th in the player vote among guards. Not 11th overall, 11th among guards. There are not 10 better guards in the WNBA right now by any objective statistical measure, and yet the players themselves ranked her lower than Marina Mabrey, Sonia Citron, Alicia Gray, Ryan Howard, and her own Indiana Fever teammate Kelsey Mitchell. By contrast, fans ranked her second, media ranked her third, She still earned a starter spot because fan voting carries 50% of the total weight, with media and player votes each accounting for 25%. But the message from her peers was not subtle. It was as loud and clear as a fist to the throat. This is the third consecutive year that Clark's fellow WNBA players have dramatically underranked her in All-Star voting relative to her actual performance and her standing with fans and media. In 2025, she was ranked 9th among guards by players. Now she has fallen further to 11th. As her numbers have gone up, her standing among her peers has gone down. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and it demands an explanation. The fan reaction was immediate and ferocious. Social media erupted. "They hate their savior so much," one post read, echoing a sentiment that trended for hours. Others called it pure jealousy, while some pointed out the absurdity of a situation where the player that opposing teams guard aggressively for 94 feet every single possession, a tell-all sign of how much respect she commands as a threat, was being ranked as though it barely belongs in the conversation. The numbers do not lie. Clark is tied for 3rd in the league in points per game, 2nd in assists overall, and 1st among guards, 3rd in three-pointers made, and in the top 10 among guards in rebounds. She has never missed the playoffs. She has made the All-Star team in every one of her 3 professional seasons. She has been one of the most efficient and effective players in the entire league this year by almost every metric that matters. And yet, 11th. Sports analyst and writer at the IX Sports spent the better part of a week trying to figure out what the disconnect was, why the narrative around the Fever and Clark was so overwhelmingly negative when the actual statistical picture told a story of a team that was 3rd in the league in assist percentage, 4th in defensive net rating, and 2nd in transition offense. Their conclusion was essentially that the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark have become surrounded by what they described as a reality distortion field, a space where facts and feelings operate in completely separate universes, and where no positive development on the court can pierce the wall of grievance and resentment that has been built up around her. The All-Star voting numbers are the most visible evidence of that distortion field in action, and they arrived at the worst possible moment for a league already dealing with the fallout from the Alyssa Thomas incident, Stephanie White's press conference, and a coaching situation that was rapidly becoming impossible to defend. Here is the thing about patterns. Individual incidents can always be explained away. One bad game, one poorly worded statement, one organizational misstep. Those things happen. They are part of the business of running a sports league, and no organization gets everything right all the time. But when you start stacking incidents on top of each other, when the explanations start piling up faster than the incidents themselves, at some point you stop seeing individual mistakes and start seeing something that looks a lot more like a policy. Intentional or not, it adds up to the same thing. And in the days surrounding the Alyssa Thomas incident and the All-Star voting controversy, another piece of the puzzle surfaced that made the pattern impossible to ignore. The WNBA released a 30th anniversary promotional poster to commemorate 3 decades of the league's existence. It was a significant moment for the organization, a chance to celebrate the players who had built the league, the culture it had created, and the explosive growth it had experienced in recent years. Caitlin Clark was not on it. Let that sink in. The player whose arrival in the WNBA coincided directly with a landmark $2.2 billion media rights deal. The player who has driven television ratings to levels the league had never seen before. The player whose games are selling out arenas around the country. The player who has arguably done more for the visibility and financial health of the WNBA in 2.5 seasons than any single player in the league's history. That player was left off the 30th anniversary commemorative poster. Fans did not take it quietly. The response online was fast and brutal. Does it even register how absurd it is to exclude Caitlin Clark from this poster? One widely circulated post read. Others questioned whether the league's leadership had completely lost the plot. And regardless of whatever internal explanation the WNBA might offer for the decision, whoever made the call, whatever the reasoning, the optics were catastrophic. You do not celebrate 30 years of your league's growth and leave off the person most responsible for the biggest growth spurt in your history, not without sending a message. And the message people received was clear. Within the WNBA's institutional machinery, there are forces that are actively resistant to centering Caitlin Clark, even when centering her would obviously serve the league's best interests. Think about what that means. A sports league exists to grow, to attract fans, to generate revenue, to build a sustainable product. Every smart business decision flows from those basic objectives. And yet, the WNBA keeps making choices, the poster, the all-star voting dynamics, the officiating inconsistencies, the way incidents involving Clark are handled publicly, that seem to push against the very player who is generating most of the league's current momentum. It is not just baffling. It is, when you look at the full picture, genuinely alarming for the future of the league. To fully appreciate how far and how fast the situation has deteriorated, you have to go back to where the cracks first became visible in the 2026 season. Back to May 30th, back to Indianapolis, and a game against the expansion Portland Fire that the Fever lost 100-84, a humiliating defeat to a brand new franchise. During that game, cameras caught what appeared to be a heated exchange between Caitlin Clark and head coach Stephanie White during a timeout. White was addressing the team, her finger jabbing in Clark's direction. Clark, seated directly in front of her, did not look happy about what she was hearing. The clip went viral almost instantly. Social media ran with it. Commentators began speculating about deep tension, about friction, about whether the coach-player relationship was fundamentally broken. Both Clark and White moved quickly to dismiss the narrative. Clark was direct. "Steph has my back more than anybody," she said. "I ride with Steph, I ride for these girls." As far as we were concerned, the moment died right then. White echoed that, describing what happened as simply coaching, challenging a competitive player in a competitive moment during a difficult loss. She also made a pointed observation about double standards. "I don't often think it becomes an issue if you're watching it in men's sports most of the time." Skip Bayless amplified the chaos by falsely reporting that White had been fired, a report that was quickly and thoroughly debunked by every credible WNBA reporter covering the Fever. Bayless doubled down anyway, arguing that regardless of whether it was true, a coach cannot show up the face of the league on camera and expect to last. His prediction was premature and wrong in its specifics, but the underlying tension he was pointing at turned out to be more real than many were willing to admit. Now, to add important context here, the Fever at that stage were actually playing reasonably well by the numbers. They were third in the league in assist percentage, fourth in defensive net rating, second in transition offense rate. Clark was putting up historic assist numbers, averaging an assist percentage of 41.8% through the stretch of games. No WNBA player had ever reached 38% in their first 3 seasons, and Clark was miles ahead of that. The narrative of dysfunction was, at least statistically, somewhat disconnected from the actual basketball being played. But statistics do not capture everything. They do not capture the atmosphere in a locker room. They do not capture the dynamics of a coaching relationship under enormous public pressure. And they do not capture the institutional decisions: whose back is publicly protected, whose name leads press conferences, who gets defended when the cameras are rolling, that define whether a player feels supported by the organization around her. And it is in that space, the space between the numbers and the lived experience, where Stephanie White's problems have been building all season long. Sports franchises are not just sporting institutions, they are businesses, and businesses make choices that either protect or damage their financial interests. The Indiana Fever, in the era of Caitlin Clark, have made choices that have raised serious questions about whether the people running this franchise understand the asset they are sitting on. The sideline confrontation in May, before anyone knew about the throat punch, before the All-Star voting, before July 1st's press conference disaster, reportedly cost the franchise $150 million in valuation. According to reports that circulated after the viral clip, the combination of fan uncertainty, negative press coverage, and the perception of organizational instability around their star player triggered a measurable drop in the franchise's assessed worth. $150 million from a video of a coaching moment during a timeout. That number tells you everything you need to know about how valuable the Caitlin Clark question is to the Indiana Fever. The franchise is worth what it is worth largely because of her. The sellout crowds, the television deals, the merchandise revenue, the national attention, it flows through her. And when fans sense, even for a moment, that the organization is not properly aligned behind her, the financial consequences are immediate and severe. Fans made their positions clear in the comments and on social media in terms that left no room for ambiguity. We all started watching the WNBA because of Caitlin Clark. I feel the Fever coaches are trying to sabotage her. Another, we are Caitlin Clark fans more than we are Fever fans. Don't F it up. Subscription cancellations, merchandise boycotts, fans openly discussing the idea of Clark leaving Indiana and speculating about what that would mean for a franchise that, in their view, exists primarily as a vehicle for watching her play. This is the commercial reality of the situation, stripped of all the political framing and culture war noise that tends to dominate the conversation around Clark. Whatever your feelings about the debates that swirl around her, and those debates are loud and complicated and deeply felt on all sides, the financial arithmetic is simple. Fans come to see Clark. Sponsors paid to reach the audience Clark brings. Television networks pay for the rights to broadcast games that draw the ratings Clark generates. If Clark's relationship with the Fever franchise becomes genuinely unstable, the financial damage will not stop at $150 million. And yet, the decisions keep coming that seem to chip away at exactly that relationship. The press conference that centered Thomas. The All-Star voting that showed institutional antipathy from within the league. The poster that left Clark out. The stalking situations that never generated a public statement from the coach. Each individual thing might be explainable in isolation. Together, they compose a portrait that is very difficult to look at and feel confident about the direction things are heading. Let us be precise about something. Dan Dakich is not a saint. He is not a neutral arbiter. His commentary throughout the Clark era has been pointed, often inflammatory, and at times drew criticism from multiple directions simultaneously. His defense of White in early June was aggressive enough that many Clark supporters viewed it as hostile. His language about the WNBA and the people within it has generated significant controversy. But none of that changes the significance of what his reversal represents. Because here is the thing about credibility in the media landscape. It is not about finding someone perfect and agreeing with everything they have ever said. It is about tracking what happens when someone with an established position encounters new evidence and updates their view. That is called intellectual honesty. And in a media environment where very few people are willing to publicly say, "I was wrong," or "I have changed my mind," the act of doing exactly that carries weight. Dakich defended White. He criticized Clark. He took a side. And then he watched July 1st happen. He watched White go to that podium and make Alyssa Thomas the lead item in her press conference, while Clark was sidelined with a back injury. He processed what that choice meant, not as a casual observer, but as someone who had spent weeks actively making the case for the other side. And he concluded that his previous position was no longer defensible. That is the reversal that matters, not because Dakich is the most important voice in sports media, but because his willingness to flip publicly is a symptom of something larger. The erosion of the mainstream media's reluctance to hold Stephanie White accountable. For months, the major platforms had either been silent on or actively dismissive of the concerns being raised about Stephanie White's leadership. those concerns were largely amplified by independent creators, podcasters, and analysts outside the traditional sports media apparatus. Now, the apparatus itself is starting to arrive at the same conclusions. That shift has consequences. When a mainstream voice with established credibility in the specific market being discussed reverses course and publicly calls out a local figure they previously defended, the local figure's ability to rely on media protection disappears. Every press conference Stephanie White gives from this point forward will be covered with a different kind of scrutiny. Every statement, every coaching decision, every moment where she has the opportunity to explicitly stand behind Caitlin Clark and either takes it or doesn't, all of it will be evaluated through the lens of what happened on July 1st. That is an almost impossible position to operate from, and it is a position that Stephanie White created for herself. Zoom out for a moment, because while Stephanie White is the immediate focal point of this story, the Indiana Fever head coach did not create the environment she is operating in. She is operating inside a league that has repeatedly demonstrated an inability to properly manage the Caitlin Clark situation at an institutional level. The officiating. The Alyssa Thomas throat punch was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of physical treatment that Clark has been dealing with since her first game as a WNBA professional in 2024. During her rookie season, then Chicago Sky guard Chennedy Carter had a foul upgraded to a flagrant after checking Clark with her shoulder. Each season, new incidents have emerged. Each season, the league has faced the question of whether its officiating is consistently protecting its most marketable player the same way it protects everyone else. And each season, the answer from many corners of the media and fan base has been an emphatic no. Clark herself said it plainly after the Alyssa Thomas incident. "I think at this point I know I'm going to take a couple of hard shots a game, and that's what it is," she said during her rookie season. And 2 years later, the reality has not meaningfully changed. "Our reffing just needs to be better," she said this summer. Obviously, the refs are in a really difficult spot. It's one of the hardest jobs in the world, in my opinion, is to make calls. That measured response from Clark, by the way, is part of what makes the people around her look worse by comparison. She continues to stay professional, stay focused, and stay gracious, even when the situation around her is anything but.
The commissioner. Dakich did not limit his criticism to White. He called out WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert and Fever COO and General Manager Amber Cox by name, pointing out that he had never once heard either of them stand up and make an unambiguous public statement on Clark's behalf. An executive who runs a league whose biggest star gets punched in the throat on camera and who is not heard from publicly on the matter is an executive who has made a choice about what they are willing to say out loud. Dakich labeled that choice cowardice in essentially those terms. The cultural dynamic. This is the part that is hardest to discuss cleanly because it involves identity politics that generate enormous heat on all sides. But to pretend the cultural dimension does not exist is to leave out a significant part of the story. There is a visible tension within the WNBA's player culture between the established veterans who built the league before Clark arrived and the new wave of attention that Clark's presence has generated. Some of that tension is completely understandable. Athletes who spent years building something and then watched one player arrive and become the face of everything they worked toward have complicated feelings about that. Those feelings are human and real. But complicated feelings do not justify what the all-star voting data shows. They do not justify what happened in that press conference on July 1st. They do not justify a poster that erases the most impactful player of the current era from a league anniversary celebration. When complicated feelings start driving institutional decisions, when personal dynamics within the league start shaping officiating perceptions, voting outcomes, and coaching priorities, that is when the league has a problem that goes beyond sports. That is when the product itself is compromised. Former NFL player and analyst Emmanuel Acho went as far as to declare publicly that the WNBA would be better without Caitlin Clark, calling her a bigger distraction than she is an additive. That take was immediately dismantled by Dakich and others who pointed out the mathematical absurdity of arguing that the player responsible for the league's greatest period of commercial growth is somehow a net negative. But the fact that a prominent media figure said it out loud, without apparent embarrassment, tells you something about how polarized the conversation around Clark has become and how far some voices are willing to go to frame her presence as a problem rather than a gift. Here is the honest question. After everything, the throat punch, the press conference, the all-star voting, the poster, the $150 million valuation hit, Dakich's reversal, the pattern that keeps accumulating, is there a path forward for Stephanie White and the Indiana Fever that restores trust and stabilizes the situation before real damage becomes permanent damage? In theory, yes. In practice, it requires a level of self-awareness and decisive action that has not been evident from this organization so far. What it would look like is actually not complicated. It would look like a Fever press conference where the first words out of Stephanie White's mouth are about Caitlin Clark, about her health, her progress, her importance to this franchise, and the organization's absolute commitment to making sure she is protected, celebrated, and given every resource she needs to succeed. It would look like a front office that stops being silent on the issues that matter to the players they are responsible for and starts being as vocal about Clark and Cunningham's real-world safety as they apparently are about online sentiment directed at members of opposing teams. And it would look like a coaching staff that understands on a fundamental level that the rules for managing the most scrutinized player in women's basketball history are different from the rules for managing everyone else. Not because she deserves special treatment in any unfair sense, but because the stakes around her decisions are exponentially higher. And it would look like a league from the commissioner's office on down that stops treating the Caitlin Clark situation as a culture war to be managed and starts treating it as a business opportunity to be maximized, because that is exactly what it is. The growth window is real. The audience Clark attracted is real. The ratings, the deals, the sold-out buildings, all of it is real, and all of it is fragile. Momentum requires maintenance, and right now, the people responsible for maintaining it keep making choices that chip away at it instead. Christy Sides, the coach White replaced, is now leading a program in Canada and preparing for a FIBA World Basketball event. When she was let go, there were questions about the decision. There was uncertainty. There was a segment of the fan base that was skeptical the change would work out. Those same people are now comparing the coaching eras and asking whether the transition actually represented an upgrade. That comparison is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because the evidence on the ground, the press conferences, the optics, the publicly documented choices about who gets defended and when, has given it oxygen. That is the cost of what has been built over the past several months. That is what poor institutional decision-making looks like when it compounds over time. And now it has reached the point where a credible Indiana sports voice, who was publicly defending the coach just weeks ago, has done a full reversal and joined the chorus of critics. Caitlin Clark is not a renewable resource. She will not be a 24-year-old generational talent playing the best basketball of her life forever. The window of explosive growth that her arrival created, the new fans, the expanded TV deals, the sold-out arenas, the national media coverage, is open right now. It will not stay open indefinitely. And every week that passes with dysfunction swirling around her, with institutional decisions that signal ambivalence about her centrality to the league's future, with coaching choices that raise questions instead of resolving them, is a week where some portion of that new audience decides they have better things to do on a Tuesday night. Dan Dakich's reversal is significant not because of who he is, but because of what his reversal represents. It represents the moment when the mainstream media machinery, which had been relatively slow to apply the same scrutiny to Stephanie White that independent voices had been applying for months, arrived at the destination those voices had already reached. The protection is gone. The benefit of the doubt has been exhausted. And now, every move Stephanie White makes will be evaluated with a new level of skepticism that she earned through her own choices.
The story of this WNBA season is not really about a throat punch. It is not really about a press conference or a podcast or a voting data chart. It is about a question that the Indiana Fever and the broader WNBA have been refusing to answer clearly for too long. Whose side are you on? When Caitlin Clark needed her coach to stand at a podium and say without hesitation that the Indiana Fever stand behind her, that they will fight for her, protect her, and make it absolutely clear to every player in the league that there are consequences for what happened on June 24th, Stephanie White stood at that podium and talked about Alyssa Thomas. That choice will follow her. It will follow this franchise, and it will follow the WNBA into every conversation about whether this league is capable of being what it needs to be in order to sustain what Clark has built. The mainstream has caught up. The credible defenders have reversed course. The numbers are damning. The pattern is clear. Something needs to change, and the clock is ticking.